So in the summer of 1980, at the end of my first year of university, when I was 18 years old, I was walking up Rundle Mall in Adelaide between Christmas and New Year and felt a massive pain in my stomach. I was outside Myers, which is it's a slightly more modern version of Myers than was in 1980. And I remember having to hold on to the windows that were still displaying the Christmas stories. I carried on and I got to work at Lawrence's Tobacconist and Souvenir Store. Another pain, and I folded over but insisted that I was okay. Around lunchtime, I had another attack and almost knocked over an entire display of stock. I ended up calling my mum, who picked me up. I was at the doctor's at 3 o'clock and I was at the operating table at 6 p.m. Several hours later, when I was coming back in and out of consciousness, I was incredibly confused. I was feeling so cold, a cold that you cannot imagine. And yet I had nothing on me apart from a pair of jocks, and my body was surrounded by ice packs. My brain was terribly confused. Shortly afterwards, I was transferred to Queen Elizabeth Hospital intensive care unit by an ambulance. And certainly this was not the plan that I had in mind for a simple appendix operation. My temperature overnight peaked at 41.5 degrees. That's basically body melting temperature. I spent well over a week in hospital recovering and had no answers from the doctors. At my follow-up appointment with my surgeon some 6 weeks later, fortunately the scar had healed very well. And then he went on to say, well, we really don't know what happened, but the most likely cause is a rare condition called malignant hypopraxia of anesthesia, and so he went on and on droning in my head. My dad and I didn't hear anything beyond the word malignant. I think he realised the shock on our face that we weren't hearing, and so he stopped. No, it's not cancer. Malignant simply means permanent. And he started again, trying to explain that I might possibly have this really rare condition, being allergic to some anesthetics. There are only 3 places in the world that you can be tested. Unfortunately, one was in Canberra. So at the end of the first third of the following year at university, I hopped on a plane and went to Canberra for an operation. This did my head in yet once again, because I'd been told that if I had this condition, I was the first person to survive. Normally, the first person is identified in the family with this because they die. And I was going to have to go to Canberra and have another operation. I was the sickest I'd ever been after surgery, and I'd had many surgeries in my young 18 years. So I suspect it was due to having the safest of safest anaesthetics. So yes, I have a genetic disorder that's a dominant gene. So 3 out of 5 kids, if I were to have that many, would have this particular gene. Fair enough to say that my academic year was quite disrupted. I was on crutches for 4 to 6 weeks when returning from Canberra. And if anybody knows Flinders University in the foothills of Adelaide, being on crutches in the foothills is somewhat of a challenge. I didn't realise the mental health impact this had on me, and it really wasn't addressed at all at that time. I passed most of my subjects, but received compensatory passes in 2 core subjects, which meant I needed to do those again, leading to another year at university. Fortunately, in those days, university was free. So I decided to undertake study just to fill up my day, and ended up taking a whole lot of computer science subjects. I ended up completely confusing the university because I was completing a Bachelor of Economics, but the School of Mathematics was really concerned, given I'd spent so much time with them, because it seemed I was 1 subject short of a BA in computer science. This then led me to a career that I'd never heard of, IT audit. I joined TAA, Australian Airlines in Melbourne in 1984. My first professional experience was with the head of department who was a UK chartered accountant, and he taught me very much about the concept of a vocation. In my second year, after completing a financial audit of the Western Australian Accounts Receivable Ledger, remembering this is before Visa and MasterCard were in the country, so these were huge ledgers, I received a call from the head of internal audit to have a conversation. One of the critical tests I did was looking at all statements to clients that had a TAA office address. There was some on my listing, I'd reported them to the credit controller and included them in my report. I was rather nervous. I wasn't suspended, but I was sent home for a few days. After a couple of nervous days, I came back to the office and met again with my leadership team to be told that my findings and recommendations were appropriate and the work papers were full, complete and appropriately cross-referenced, something I hated doing. So now my skills will be required to assist in the resulting investigation. To cut a very long story short, the sales rep felt the airline was not looking after some of the clients well enough. He found a mate had a dormant account and he took control of it and used the dormant account to wash funds through. So say, selling a $6,000 business class ticket for $5,000. There was enough money coming in to keep the credit controller at bay, even though the balances were increasing. Then came along this junior internal auditor. I identified these accounts, then the credit controller started looking at these accounts, and there was this massive arm wrestle between credit control and sales rep who was going to negotiate the repayment of the outstanding $500,000. The sales rep was struggling to keep credit control at bay, so he needed a solution. When you're facing being found out about a major fraud, fight and flight comes into play and irrational thoughts happen. So a solution was found. If the client, his mate, died, the airline would write off the debt. So into his garage he went, collected an axe, put it in his car, drove to his mate's office, swung the axe to chop his mate's head off. Fortunately, he failed, went through his collarbone, so now we had a $500,000 fraud and an attempted murder charge. So then I added forensic investigation to my career, and now I am a fully certified fraud examiner. After the airline, I started with Ernst & Whinney and was there through the merger with Arthur Young, creating what is now known as EY. Here I learnt about managing teams overseas, particularly in the Philippines, and bringing about change in clients and developing internal audit units. I learned about cultural differences, bombings, typhoons, and coups. In my second 2-month trip as a team leader, we had a bomb going off every day, plus the odd typhoon. Coups usually happened on Friday evenings, as you lost your salary when you had a coup, so doing of the weekend minimised the loss of salary. One day I noticed a number of telltale signs one morning, received some confirmation from my sources, and then contacted the Deputy Charge of Affairs at our embassy. Hi John, Jason here. Hearing there might be a coup tonight. Any information? Oh, hi Jason, good to hear from you. The official Australian position is there are no issues in the Philippines. However, on a personal note, when I was talking with my wife this morning, she tells me the shopping in Hong Kong this weekend is particularly good. We had an established contingency plan with 2 options. I had time to exit Hong Kong. However, I was delayed due to a typhoon. After EY, I moved to Sydney to join Westpac as one of the new non-bankers they wanted to bring in to help bring about change. Unfortunately, Westpac didn't support the non-bank managers nor the change very well. The move from Melbourne to Sydney also had some personal challenges. 3 months after moving, my parents were returning to Adelaide from Queensland and going to spend a week with me in Sydney. I'd finally decided to confront my father. It had taken me a long time to get up the courage for this. In the back of my mind, one of the reasons for the move to Sydney was Melbourne was too close to Adelaide. They were due on Saturday. I returned home from a dinner on Thursday night to a message on my answering machine to urgently call where they were staying. But my dad had already died by the time I called. I then had an amazing journey as a startup executive at National Rail. I was the head of internal audit. The function was outsourced. I was involved in one of the early major IT outsourcing deals, and we did the largest locomotive purchase in Australia's history. I knew it was going to be different when on the first day after finding my office, the GM HR who interviewed me came in to say hi. And what are you doing next Monday, Jason? Well, it seemed my diary was relatively free. What did you have in mind, Barry? Well, we've got a meeting with the Secretary of the ACTU and other union leaders, and I need you to do a presentation on internal control structures in a team-based structure authority model. We made so much up as we were going along. Change was dramatic and dynamic in that organisation. I could talk about baseball bats, but perhaps not. In Sydney, as in Melbourne, I was doing a lot of youth work. I'm saying nothing, Aidan. I was doing a lot of youth work. And I was on the board of the National Christian Youth Convention in Canberra for 2,500 people. It was very hard and challenging, week-long conference with a couple of controversies. Afterwards, I was exhausted, and my minister and chair of elders noticed I needed a break and gave me leave of absence from my roles for a while. But rather than getting better, I was getting worse and worse. Eventually, a friend of mine suggested I needed to see a therapist. Oops. Thank you. I might just look at you, Hugh. What commenced was 3 of the most difficult years of my life to that point of time. I was having to confront the abuse that I suffered as a child and young adult. My biggest challenge was working through the fact that my abuse was emotional. I could understand sexual abuse. I could understand physical abuse. But emotional abuse in my mind was simply a sign of weakness. One of my therapists, who'd been working in practice for over 30 years, kept telling me mine was the worst case of emotional abuse he'd ever dealt with. Some of my poetry, which I've unfortunately lost, had him cry, but none of this was cutting through for me. During these 3 years, a couple of times the issues of my sexual exploration in my early teens and late 20s came up, but I managed to convince them it really wasn't an issue. Through these 3 years, I needed 3 therapists and a program, which finally broke the blockage for me on emotional abuse. A small but critically important group of friends provided support, and finally I started to level out. During this time of my journey, I had several suicidal episodes, but I never talked about them with my therapist. Being suicidal, I thought, was a sign of weakness, not being acceptable. But fortunately, every time I worked out the way to achieve it and to do it in such a way that it didn't look like suicide, something intervened and I didn't follow through. The other mistake I made was to not use the company's employee assistance program to help me with the related consequences at my work through these major issues. After finishing my therapy, there was a group at church that I'd been hanging around with for years, and I thought one of the women had an interest in me, so I pursued her. On our wedding night, when I was dancing with my mum, she commented at how proud my dad would have been of the wedding. I recall how that comment jarred on me, and my son was born later that year. After we married, I decided to get an ear pierced, really for when I was not at work. It was an internal, I'm off the clock internal message. And I thought it was strange that the person who was doing the piercing started setting up for my right ear, the gay ear. But I corrected her very quickly to put it in the left. Of course, I'm not going to be able to do this quickly when I'm on show. Yep. There we go. There we go. Thank you. I then started the internal audit function for Fujitsu Australia in the South Pacific, and my daughter arrived. Fortunately, I was not there very long and was headhunted into an insurance company to head their administration function, which had primarily been outsourced and failed, which I successfully turned around. But then I was made redundant from that role. I ended up establishing the procurement and probity practice for a growing consulting firm from Canberra in their Sydney office, which then led to me establishing my own firm with an old church colleague from Canberra, who I later discovered was gay. And our head of HR consulting, I discovered his long-term partner is the only editor of DNA magazine. You may or may not have heard of that, which is a major gay magazine, who was also gay. In one of my second episodes of mental health issues, we simply saw this as being overworked and we avoided everything else. It helped and I was able to get back to my keyboard. We subsequently merged with Grant Thornton, and I was a partner for about 7 months when the GFC hit and they decided to close down the risk practice, which was odd given risk consulting was the one thing everybody wanted in the GFC. So being made redundant a second time in a major financial crisis was nonetheless a bit of a challenge. But using my networks, I was able to find roles and then re-establish my own business. I successfully rebuilt my firm focusing on probity and corporate and IT governance. Then in 2014, once again, my mental health significantly deteriorated. This time, my doctor insisted that I go on medication, having resisted all previous times, and I was referred to a new psychologist. It was helpful, but as time went on, as I drove often to see her at her office, often getting there early and waiting in the car park, I was thinking, would I raise the topic this week? My therapist had come from a Christian clinic, and I kept thinking, if I raised the topic, would she be able to deal with it clinically or from a Christian mindset? The risks were too high for me, so I simply stopped seeing her. However, in my own time, I started to voice the topic to myself. After 20 years of being married and with 2 teenage children, I was able to voice that I was in fact gay. Vocalising this to myself was more powerful than I could have ever imagined. A change was starting, but I had no idea where it was going to lead. Surprisingly though, my mental health deteriorated again. My wife wanted me to go back and see my psychologist and I wouldn't. I told her there was no point in seeing her, so she insisted I go back to see our doctor, find a new therapist, and then start again. So my doctor was the first person I told I was gay, which was particularly scary as our medical practice was made up of a group of Christians. However, he was incredibly supportive and also incredibly honest, telling me that this all now made sense given my mental health issues. But he then went on to say, I have absolutely no idea where to refer you. So we worked together to find a new and appropriate psychologist to help me with the issues I was dealing with. Once again, there were several periods where I was suicidal. Even after coming out, the pain and more importantly, the shame seemed overwhelming. After one episode, my doctor was so concerned that he increased my medication so much that it made me unable to think and work. After about 6 weeks, I needed this reviewed because I needed to work. So we talked about where my head was at. We found a new set of drugs that managed my moods better and allowed me to work, although not at the level I was used to. My psychologist used an analogy that I could understand. He said, my life is like a stock market. It's generally trending upwards, but on a day-to-day basis, it may go up some or down a bit. But every now and again, there are stock market crashes, and they were the ones that related to my suicidality. I needed to develop techniques to manage myself through them. The other thing he taught me was there was no roadmap. Each of our journeys is absolutely unique. One of the techniques I've used all my life to manage my issues is to be incredibly busy. My earliest recollection around the age of 15 is being taken by my mum to our doctor because there was yet another thing I wanted to do, and it took the doctor to convince me not to engage in other activity. I don't need this technique anymore, but it's so ingrained in how I operate that it's proving to be one of the hardest things to change. There were some comments my wife was making that my therapist started to get concerned and prepare me for coming out. And I was forced to come out earlier than planned and prepare me for a conversation with my children and telling other people. My conversation with her was not when I wanted it to be. I was working towards late October. However, in late August 2015, she really wanted to know what was happening. I was using all the deflection techniques that I was taught, but it wasn't enough. I eventually indicated that I didn't want to talk about this until after our son had finished his HSC. Then came the bombshell question. So, you have a terminal illness, do you? This was not in the scenario book that we had worked up. I delved into all the techniques to manage the unexpected and then to realise there was only one answer. I stumbled and paused. I stumbled some more and paused some more, then eventually said no. Nowhere to go. I finally said, I've had to come to accept that I'm gay. I had no idea how she would react. I had some hopes, but fortunately her response resembled those hopes. She was troubled, she was scared, but she was very generous. She even did make the comment that she wondered if I was in fact bisexual. Then started a whole series of challenging conversations. We explored options. But as I was already further down this pathway than her, I already knew the outcome, that we would ultimately separate. On the Friday after my son's last exam, we spoke to the kids one by one. My son first. As an 18-year-old male with typical conversation skills, he didn't say very much. When he left the study, he gave Mum a hug and walked on, and my heart sank. But then he swung around. He walked back and he gave me a hug. When I reread his Christmas card from only a few months later, I still cry. My daughter was next. We'd been talking about cohabitating until she had finished her year 12. I was not committed, but it said I'd give it a go. We explained what was happening. She's a tough girl. She plays sport at a high level, even at the age of 15, and had played a 3-day statewide netball competition with a broken arm. But she started to cry. It confused us because she is not a crier. We stopped and checked in what was happening for her, and her response stunned me. She didn't want to be responsible for us cohabitating. What she wanted was for both of us to be happy, whatever that looked like. I was learning the lessons of the LGBTIQ community, the continuum of coming out. A key lesson I learnt was to only tell people when there was a benefit for me, and that significantly changed and improved my mindset, although I was not always in control of that. Fortunately, I only have ever had a few negative reactions, but also, fortunately, some funny ones. Like the one with my principal consultant, who I decided to tell over coffee at our local cafe. I was running late, so I texted him my order. My decaf soya flat white. Upon arrival, he told me how gay he felt in ordering my coffee. And then to tell me about the new executive of our new client who was so obviously gay. He still reflects in horrors at my method of coming out to him. Yes, I'm just like the coffee you ordered. I was challenged by a very senior gay businessman who I took counsel on to go find a float for Mardi Gras in a few months' time. Next slide. And the next slide. I rejected the idea, but a few months later, in March 2016, I was in a community group, marching and kissing my way down Oxford Street. and I've done so every year since, in fact organising our group this year. Through my Uniting Church life, I've always had an interest in social justice, but I never had a real personal cause. Now I did. The intersectionality of Christianity with LGBTIQ people was now a personal social justice cause. So in Christmas 2017, I got both ears pierced. See if I can do it quicker this time. And this is the harder ear. Good so far. We did it. Well done. Once again, I'm using this as a technique for when I'm off work. This time is for me. It's not a statement, nor is it for anyone else. But in my advocacy and volunteering work off the clock, I do dress up a bit and I wear my earrings in those environments. My coming out was particularly badly timed. Just in time for the lead-up arguments around the same-gender marriage, the postal survey, which was particularly horrendous as a campaigner. I was one of the few campaigners in Bennelong. I received numerous nooses and messages such as all LGBTIQ kids should be killed. Then the debate in Parliament, then talking to people who thought now that we had marriage equality, everything was solved. Then into the Ruddock inquiry into religious freedom, which I call religious freedom privilege. And then for the first time, I was a member of the Uniting Churches Assembly. It's a national parliament, which only meets once every 3 years to debate for 6 days its position on marriage, which ultimately led for a position of conscience for ministers and parishes. I also then in December received my first online homophobic attack. I excluded the postal survey stuff. That was just horrendous, but post that. And this was from somebody in my sporting association, and the investigation took 9 months. I was very reluctant to complain, but when I realised how hard it was for me to complain, I then realised how much harder it would be for a 15, an 18 or a 21-year-old. So I felt I needed to. For me, all of these were devastating processes, and I was significantly personally underprepared. It was the intensity, the sheer volume of events in such a compressed timeline that even had the most hardened 30-year LGBTIQ campaign that's struggling. Just as people suffer through the institution child sexual abuse and are reliving that through the Royal Commission and now criminal charges, we talk of repetitive mental health re-trauma. In August last year, I went to Stanford University to attend the 3rd LGBTIQ Executive Leadership Program, with just over 50 of the most amazing LGBTIQ leaders from around the world. 1/3 came from outside the US. It was here that I learnt the courage of and the courage for change. And most importantly, the courage to be who I am wherever I am. I was amazed that others took courage from my presence, but they all gave me courage in spades, in addition to the professors and the guest lecturers. In my current consulting role, I'm an interim CEO for a major cemetery. I've not pushed that I'm a member of the LGBTIQ community, but I no longer hide it. There have been more open and natural conversations in the workplace, which have been positive, and that's been quite wonderful. In my advocacy work, like many advocates, we are pushing back on the Conservative right's attack on transgender people, supporting the right for intersex people and the genital mutilation that they have in the past automatically suffered through unnecessary surgery after their birth to make them closer to normal, whatever that is. I'm supporting my bisexual friends who often feel rejected by everyone and all, including, unfortunately, in some cases, from the LGBTIQ community. And I'm also engaged in international advocacy, such as the current issue in Brunei, which today the new law came into effect for the stoning to death of gay people. The lesson for me around this has been several. That I needed courage to go out. As I've done, and I've met my local MP, to talk about that my electorate in Ryde in the inner northwest has had for the last 10 years the third highest rate of new HIV transmissions, but he's never been told that. Change is often brought about by effective political lobbying, but also by getting to know people, to know that the others are just as valid human beings as they are. Other aspects is to be prepared for my own personal safety, not only in a physical sense, but also mentally and emotionally. I suspect that I'm one of the first out LGBTIQ people to attend the Uniting Church's national conference for our Chinese communities, because in my parish, where I'm a leader, we're investing heavily in growing a new Chinese community in our church. The broader Chinese community has been very active against safe schools, marriage equality, so I knew it was going to be difficult. My own electorate of Bennelong, with a significant Asian population, just voted no in the postal survey. But I got through the conference, even though I was verbally attacked, in love of course, due to having my safety plan that I was able to execute and good debriefing soon afterwards. But more importantly, the relationships I wanted to build have been built. Whilst I was on my writing retreat in Bangkok, I had my jacket made. A lot of my personal, non-professional wardrobe has changed a lot over the last 3 years. And it perhaps actually reflects what my mother allowed me to wear when I was much younger. I was probably the only teenager in the 1970s that had his own personal suit. However, I think my green flared corduroy trousers were far more common back then. Whilst I'm still on medication and coming to accept that that may be for a reality for a while to come, I'm seeing a much rosier future on my inside. So when I look back, what have been some of the themes? Change is often not our choice. My medical history and its huge impacts of my life were not my choice, and I had to work with and use them to my advantage, not only to manage my health, but also embracing the change that took me in a completely different career path than I had ever imagined. That has been amazing. Being an actor to avoid being who I am has been a massive negative impact on my life and my health. I'm still overcommitted, and as I said, one of the techniques I use to avoid dealing with accepting who I am in the past as a survival technique is proving to be very hard to change. As leaders, we need to be aware of mental health, our own and people who work for us. In my current role, I've openly spoken about my mental health issues and talked about when we were launching the EAP program at work, and talked about my failure of not engaging with my EAP provider when I was working through those first issues. I've learned that sometimes we don't need to tell everyone everything. The value of determining why I need to tell someone about myself and why that conversation is important to me has been invaluable. This for me was a foreign concept that I needed to be selfish. And finally, I learned that I needed courage. Courage simply to allow myself to be the real person that I am. I was lucky to be gifted that courage through my time at Stanford University, and I hope that this can be a gift of courage for you.